Hello dear friends, welcome to my channel, We Love Creepy. Before watching, I will ask you to support my channel by subscribing, liking and commenting. It helps to promote the channel, and discussing stories with others is very interesting. Who wants can support by donation on the link in the description or by scanning this QR code. Also, don't forget to send your stories to me on email or in the Telegram channel, the link in the description. It is quite possible that in the next video will be your story. Make some tea, coffee, grab some snacks, get comfy in your chair, and we'll start tickling your nerves. Enjoy the show. Story 1. Creepy Siberian Village. The train, moving slowly through the snowdrifts, seemed to be slowing down every minute. Blazkowicz could no longer remember the last time he had felt such a chill. The farewells of his colleagues in Moscow still rang in his ears, but only ghostly memories remained of the warmth of the capital's streets. Here we go. The conductor looked into the compartment. Further only on horseback, the taiga is no joke. Blazkowicz rose from the hard seat and slipped his holstered belt over his shoulders. The gun is in place, as is the notepad. He had to deal with a series of brutal murders that occurred in a remote village lost among the Siberian forests. Rumor has it that villagers were killed with savage cruelty, bodies found torn apart. The locals were already whispering about a werewolf wolf. When he stepped onto the platforms, he was greeted by two stern faces. One tall, lean, with a serious look, the other sturdier, with a reddish beard peeking out from under his hat. "Comrade Blazkowicz?" the skinny man asked, coming closer. "Yeah, it's me, the guides?" he asked, glancing at the horses harnessed to the wooden sleigh. "That's right, I'm Melnik, local investigator. And this is Kalganov, the forester. He knows every snowdrift around here." Kalganov, the red-bearded man, nodded, glancing at Blazkowicz. "How far are we going?" Blazkowicz asked, putting on his gloves and wrapping himself chillily in his overcoat. "The village is about 2 hours from here," Melnik replied. "But we have to hurry, it's going to start snowing harder." As they loaded into the sleigh, the horses trotted smoothly. The trees on the side stood black silhouettes against the white landscape. Blazkowicz tried to focus on the case. He knew that superstition and fear were intertwined with reality in these places, and it was his job to separate one from the other. The village met them with gloom. Frozen in time, it consisted of a dozen wooden huts. The walls of the houses are blackened by time and weather, the windows draped with dim curtains. Not a single light, only in one hut flickered the light of a kerosene lamp. "No one goes out after sundown," Melnik explained briefly. "People are afraid. They say there's something wrong in the woods. I'm here to find out what it is," Blazkowicz replied briefly, glancing at the forest. They approached the nearest hut. The miller knocked on the door. After a moment it opened, and they were allowed inside. The old man stood by the stove, wiping his hands on his dirty apron. "What do you know, Grandpa?" Melnik started from the doorstep. "Oh, it's an evil force. A wolf, I tell you, a werewolf." The old man's voice trembled. "A week ago, Ivanov's family went missing. They found them the next morning, bodies mutilated like a beast." Blazkowicz listened intently, making notes in his notebook. "Werewolves don't exist," he said stiffly. "We need to look for traces of the real killer." "You, young man, don't know," the old man whispered, raising his head. "We've lived here all our lives. Wolves haven't touched us before. Now something else comes out at night. People are afraid to even let their dogs out." Blazkowicz squinted his eyes. He was used to superstition, but he knew from experience. There is always a person behind every tale of wickedness. A man with dirty hands and creepy intentions. There are witnesses. Did anyone see what happened? No witnesses, just rumors. The miller faltered. But the village is really scared. Everyone's sure it's not human. There are claw marks on the bodies. Too big for the average beast. Kalganov, who had been silent until that moment, sighed heavily and glanced at the furnace. "Can we talk to the people who found the bodies?" Blazkowicz asked. "We'll talk tomorrow at dawn," Melnik replied briefly. "No one's coming out now. Fear is stronger than even frost." Blazkowicz fell silent, sensing that it was going to be a long night. He knew that in such places the ancient primal part of man always came to the forefront. Fear of the unknown, but that fear could be a clue. Blazkowicz is determined to find the true killer. Night came quickly. Melnik and Kalganov settled down in the same hut with him, while Blazkowicz tried to sleep, listening to the howling wind outside the window. Suddenly, something alerted him. In the darkness, he caught a faint growl coming from outside. Quiet, low, as if a beast was nearby. He stood up, threw on his jacket, and looked out the window. In the distance, on the outskirts of the village, a dark figure that didn't look human flashed by. She moved smoothly, like a predator, and soon disappeared into a dense part of the forest. Blazkowicz clutched his gun without waiting for dawn and decided to act. He opened the door and stepped out into the night, heading towards the woods. Just as his feet stepped onto the frozen ground, the feeling of something unnatural intensified. The deafening crunch of snow under his boots was the only sound as he slowly made his way into the woods. Blazkowicz stopped, trying to focus, when he heard the growling again, closer than before. Suddenly the forest came alive. The branches parted and a creature sprang out of the thick shadows. It was a huge wolf, but its eyes glowed with devilish fire. Blazkowicz froze, realizing that this was an unusual beast. The creature stopped a few paces away, growling, showing huge fangs. "Get back!" he shouted, pulling out his gun and pointing it at the wolf. The beast didn't move. He continued to growl as he studied Blazkowicz, then abruptly tore away and disappeared into the depths of the forest. It took Blazkowicz a long time to come to his senses, realizing that he had just encountered something he could not explain by logic or science. At dawn, Blazkowicz told Melnik and Kalganov about the meeting. The forester listened in silence. "I know the place," he said. "There's an old trail that everyone goes around. It leads to an ancient forest where, according to legend, the guardian spirit of the wolves lives." "Legends don't matter," Blazkowicz replied, but unease settled inside him. He couldn't forget the glowing eyes of the beast. Soon they traveled to the spot where the first body was found. Blazkowicz studied his surroundings, trying to find even the slightest clue, but the forest remained menacingly silent. Here, the miller pointed to an old hedge behind which lay something black. When Blazkowicz came closer, he froze. It was a corpse, torn to shreds. Clothes ripped, body torn apart as if someone had torn it with inhuman strength with claws. Blazkowicz felt a chill run down his back. He'd seen a lot of dead bodies in his service, but this, it was something else. "A wolf won't do that," Kalganov said hoarsely as he stood nearby. "I've seen a lot of wolves, but ones like this." "There's no such thing!" Blazkowicz crouched beside the body, examining the wounds. The claw marks were too deep for an ordinary beast. He felt the ground around him. There were no paw prints, just blurry bloodstains in the snow. "It's definitely not human," Melnik muttered quietly, looking around. "Well, what is it then?" "The question is not what it is," Blazkowicz replied, slowly getting up, "but how to stop it." The village was unaccustomedly quiet at night. It seemed that even the wind had fallen silent in anticipation of something terrible. People hid in their homes, barricading doors and windows, leaving only the dim light of kerosene lamps. No one dared to go outside. Blazkowicz sat at the window, clutching the handle of his pistol tightly. Every rustle outside the window made him tense up. His mind tossed between logic and what he was seeing. There was no rational explanation for what was going on in this wilderness. A werewolf, or something ancient from the depths of the Siberian forests that people preferred not to talk about. Steps, a light squeak of snow. Blazkowicz tensed. A shadow flashed outside the window. She was there again, the same figure he had seen the night before. But now she wasn't hiding. She was slowly approaching his house. He pitched forward, clutching the grip of his gun even tighter, and slowly walked toward the door. My heart was beating in my chest like a hammer. Moonlight dimly illuminated the deserted village street. The shadow froze a few paces from the door, waiting. Blazkowicz swung the door open abruptly and stepped outside. The shadow trembled slightly but didn't go away. He saw her more clearly. It was human but with inhuman grace. The figure stood motionless, watching Blazkowicz. "Who are you?" Blazkowicz shouted, pointing his gun. The shadow moved slowly forward. The face of the man who emerged from the darkness was familiar. It was one of the villagers, the same Ivan who had disappeared a few days ago. His picture was shown by Melnik. Ivan? Blazkowicz blinked. You're alive? Except it wasn't Ivan anymore. His eyes glowed with the same cold light as Wolf's. The moment Blazkowicz took a step back, the man's body began to transform, stretching out, obeying an unknown force. His fingers turned into claws, his clothes ripped to shreds, turning Ivan into a creature with wolf features and human ones at the same time. Blazkowicz shoots in for a takedown. The bullet pierced the body, but the werewolf didn't even flinch. Instead, the creature rushed forward with inhuman speed, waving its claws. Blazkowicz barely had time to roll to the side, feeling the werewolf's claws scrape his shoulder. The werewolf darted away, and Blazkowicz fired another shot, aiming for the head. The creature stopped for a moment, hesitated, spat out an ominous growl, and disappeared into the shadows of the trees. Blazkowicz, breathing heavily, slowly lowered his gun. He knew his bullets wouldn't stop this thing. The next morning, Blazkowicz called Melnik and Kalganov to the forest where the werewolf had disappeared during the night. There were no footprints, as before. Kalganov was silent, glancing glumly around the forest. "Did you say there was a trail to the old forest?" Blazkowicz said, looking at Kalganov. The forester nodded, his eyes full of anxiety. "Yeah, but this place is skirting him. The spirits of the wolves are there. Those who go there don't come back. I don't think we can let this go unchallenged." Blazkowicz replied stiffly, "We don't have a choice." The trail was narrow and winding, barely visible under the snow. The trees grew darker as they went deeper, and the forest seemed more and more hostile. Melnik walked ahead, clutching his rifle tightly, and Kalganov walked behind, glancing anxiously around. They walked for a long time. Only reaching the place by nightfall, they came to a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone, all jagged and cracked. There were strange symbols carved on its surface. "It's here," Miller whispered. Blazkowicz walked over to the stone and touched it with his hand. Ice burned his fingers, but he didn't remove his hand. He suspected that this place was connected to what was going on in the village. Perhaps it was an ancient altar connected to the spirits of the forest. A threatening howl came from the forest. It echoed across the clearing, and the shadows among the trees stirred. Wolves. Blazkowicz froze, staring into the darkness. Their eyes burned like lights in the night. There were many of them, and they surrounded them. "Hold your fire," Blazkowicz said quietly. One of the wolves moved forward. It was an unusual beast. His eyes were the same as a werewolf's, and his fur glistened in the light of the moon. The wolf slowly approached the stone, its claws scraping across the frozen ground. "What do they want?" Kalganov whispered, clutching his rifle. "I guess we'll find out soon enough," Blazkowicz replied quietly. He knew the wolves didn't just come. They had something to do with this place, and now they were waiting. The wolf, standing by the rock, raised its head and let out a howl that echoed through the forest. The other wolves answered him, and at that moment the ice around the rock began to crack. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and a cold wind rushed out of a crack in the stone. The wolves began to move faster, their eyes burning ever brighter. Blazkowicz realized they were not in control. They were led by the power associated with this place. "Let's go!" he shouted, grabbing Miller by the shoulder. But it was too late. The branches of the trees around them began to move. The shadows thickened, and Blazkowicz realized that this place was more than just an ancient altar. It was a portal to another world, a world of spirits and beings that did not belong to human reality. One of the wolves lunged at Kalganov, knocking him to the ground. The forester's shout echoed across the clearing, and his gun shot into the air, but the wolves were fast. Claws dug into his chest, tearing the flesh, and blood splattered onto the snow. Blazkowicz fired, but the bullets didn't stop the wolves. The miller looked around and tried to run away, but the shadows of the trees closed around him, taking him deep into the forest. Blazkowicz was left alone. The wolves surrounded him but did not attack. They only watched as the shadows thickened around the stone. And in that moment he realized that this werewolf was the spawn of the forest itself, connected to ancient magic. And then he ran, hearing nothing but the wind whistling in his ears. Blazkowicz barely made it out of the woods, wounded and exhausted. The branches grabbed at him, trying not to release him from the dark captivity of the ancient altar. His legs barely held him up. Every step felt like a pain in his body. He didn't think about staying alive. He just moved forward, driven by instinct, feeling the eyes of the wolves on him. Or did he feel like they were following him? When he finally reached the village, it was morning. The sun was rising over the snow-covered hills, casting the world in a dim light. The villagers looked out of their windows, whispering fearfully among themselves. Blazkowicz was pale, his clothes were tattered, his face covered with bloody cuts. He entered the hut and collapsed to the floor, unable to move any longer. The old man immediately ran up. "Have you seen this beast?" The old man muttered, his eyes glistening with fear. "It's not just a beast," Blazkowicz exhaled, trying to come to his senses. "It's something ancient, born of the forest. Werewolf. He is the spirit of this place." The old man nodded as if he didn't doubt it for a second. "I told you it's not all easy. Our ancestors knew that the forest could retaliate." He shook his head. "You wouldn't be allowed back in if it wasn't for the spirit of the forest. For whatever reason, he let you go, apparently to get you to tell me." Blazkowicz stared silently into the fire. He had no time to argue with superstitious old men, but he knew one thing. The power that lurked in this forest was far more terrifying than he had realized. It wasn't just a string of murders. It was ancient magic embodied in the wolves, in the spirit of the forest that protected its territory. The next day, Blazkowicz packed his belongings. His task seemed to be accomplished, but the feeling of unease would not let go. The werewolf was not defeated, and he knew that neither weapons nor science could deal with this power. As he mounted his horse and rode back toward the station, the frosty air burned his face, reminding him of the horror he had experienced. The eyes of that wolf remained in his memory, cold, bright, watching from another world that would never allow humans to penetrate its secrets. What would he say? That's what the old man said. Friends, before we start listening to the second story, please subscribe to the channel, put likes, share this video with your friends. Be sure to leave comments. It helps a lot in promoting the channel, and for me it is motivation to do such stories. Everyone can help the channel by clicking the link in the description or by this QR code. Story 2. The Grim Legacy of the State. In the early 40s, in the midst of the war, in various distant corners of the Soviet Union began to build underground facilities for defense needs. Their purpose was kept in the strictest secrecy, and only a few initiates knew that dangerous experiments were being conducted at these facilities. One such secret facility was a bunker located deep in the Ural Mountains. KGB Captain Maxim Averyanov was sent there with the order to find out why no information from this facility has been received for the last month. The path to the bunker was not an easy one. The frosty wind hitting my face made skiing almost impossible. The roads in that area had long been snowed in, and we had to walk off-road. It took Maxim 2 days to get to the mountain gorge where the map said the object was located. All along the way, he pondered what could have happened to the secret base, but none of the assumptions provided a clear answer. When at last the metal gate leading to the bunker appeared ahead, Maxim sensed something wrong. No guards on towers, no patrols on duty. It was quiet all around, no sounds of people or the usual hum of generators that is always heard near such facilities. Maxim moved closer and noticed that the gate was ajar. The lock was hanging, but it had clearly been picked. He pushed them gently, feeling the steel creak under his hand, and stepped inside. The bunker was a huge structure going deep underground. Only hangars and a few auxiliary buildings were visible on the surface. It looked as if people had left it in a hurry. But then where did they go? There were more than 100 people working here. Maxim checked several hangars, empty. He decided to go down into the underground levels. That's where the real mysteries began. As soon as Maxim got to the first underground floor, a chill swept over him. But it was the unusual cold of a Ural winter. Here in the bunker it felt ominous, penetrating to the bone. On the walls hung pictures of scientists and military personnel working on some complex projects. Here science and power came together to create something new, but what exactly it was a strict secret. "Hey, is anyone alive in here?" Maxim called out, his voice echoing off the walls. There was no response. Moving deeper, the captain felt the tension building. In one of the corridors, he found signs of a struggle. There were overturned tables and broken appliances lying on the floor, and bloodstains on the wall. That was a bad sign. Maxim entered the lab bay. It housed offices and experimental rooms. Papers and documents were scattered everywhere, and although most of them had been destroyed or burned, some were able to be read. It was mostly data on some weird tests involving psychological effects on people. The documents showed that experiments were conducted in the bunker to influence consciousness, its capabilities, limits, and willpower. On one of the sheets he read, "Consciousness Project Phase 3. Progress is uncertain. Side effects, hallucinations, paranoia, nervous disorders. Subject 315 is out of control." Subject 315? What does it mean? Maxim thought. He continued reading, but the document didn't give any details explaining what the object was. One thing became clear. Something had gone wrong, and the scientists had lost control of their research. But where did the people go? Why isn't anyone here? All the doors are open, the hallways are empty. As he walked on, Maxim noticed an inscription on the wall, scrawled obviously in a hurry. "Do not enter Bay D3." He stopped. My subconscious told me to avoid the place, but duty demanded to explore. Moving closer to the door leading to D3 compartment, Maxim felt a strange tension in the air. The metal doors were locked, but the lock appeared to be damaged, as was the entrance to the bunker. A faint rustling sounded through the ajar door. The captain took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. Compartment D3 was a large laboratory filled with mysterious devices and capsules set along the walls. Some of the pods were broken, with shards of glass and wires lying on the floor, sticking out like torn arteries. The walls of the room were covered in cracks, but what struck Maxim the most was in the center of the room. On a metal table lay something resembling a human being. His skin, however, was transparent, and through it showed veins and internal organs that pulsed in an unnatural rhythm. This creature was not alive in the usual sense, but it was hard to call it dead either. His eyes are open, but his gaze is blank, lifeless. "Damn it!" exhaled Maxim, taking a step back. He was about to turn around and walk away, when suddenly the creature on the table let out a faint moan. Maxim froze. The creature hissed, raising a hand, trying to say something. "You're alive?" whispered Maxim. The answer to him was only an eerie wheeze that sounded like laughter. He heard a scrambling sound behind him, as if something large had moved in the dark corners of the room. A moment later, something that may have once been human emerged from the shadows. However, the creature's body was contorted, as if it had been broken and reshaped over and over again. The creature's eyes were burning red, its skin was bursting, and broken bones were sticking straight out of its body. It was apparently Facility 315. The creature froze, pondering, and then took a step forward, emitting a low, animalistic roar. Maxim quickly and professionally pulled out his gun and fired, but the bullets had no effect. The creature only roared louder and lunged at him. Maxim barely had time to dodge. The creature swept past like a wild monster, hitting the walls with such force that dust rose. Taking out his flashlight, he ran toward the exit of the compartment, feeling the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. The object pursued him, the stomping of heavy feet, muffled thumps could be heard. He reached the door, slamming it shut at the last moment in front of the creature's muzzle. There was a rumble from behind the door. It was trying to break through, and Maxim realized that this flimsy barrier wouldn't hold for long. The only option left was to shut down the system. If we block access to the energy that powered the bunker, we might be able to stop the creature. Making his way through the corridors, Maxim remembered the plan of the bunker. Stopping the generators, last chance to survive. Once in the engineering bay, Maxim pulled the main switch and the lights in the bunker went out. Usually in such cases, the emergency power was automatically turned on, but Maxim took care of that too. All sounds had fallen silent, only the faint sound of wind blowing through from the ventilation shafts. Breathing through and through, he pressed himself against the wall, preparing for any eventuality. An eerie silence. No footsteps, no roar, no nothing. Only the darkness surrounding him. Several minutes passed, but no one pursued him. The creature seemed to disappear along with the energy that powered it. Maxim took a deep breath and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. "We need to seal the bunker and get out of here. Report to your superiors. Let them deal with the problem themselves." However, he knew it wouldn't last long. The bunker was only part of something bigger that could go far beyond this base. Perhaps what was inside this facility was only the beginning. The captain left the bunker, sealing it, leaving behind a dead facility, steeped in darkness and harboring a secret that no one was ever meant to reveal. But like anything that starts with ambition, this project got out of hand. Somewhere deep down, underground, 100 meters beneath the cold Ural Mountains, still lurked the terrible Object 315, created by humans, but no longer under their control. Story 3, Taiga, unsuitable for research. The boundless, harsh, and mysterious taiga. Its vastness holds many mysteries, and its silence is deceptive. It was to such places that a KGB group led by Captain Grigory Melnikov was sent. They were tasked with investigating the strange phenomena that had been rumored. Disappearances, mirages, unknown creatures. One thing the report said was that it was an anomalous zone. Although the agency was skeptical, they checked the information thoroughly. When the team of 4 arrived on site, the first glance at the terrain was not alarming. A forest is like a forest. Mighty pine trees, moss everywhere. The hum of the river could be heard in the distance. But Grigory, long familiar with the forests, noticed something strange. The air was too still, no birds sang, and every step echoed in the silence. "Zhutkov is a quiet place," Lieutenant Alexei Volkov remarked, looking around. "It feels like the forest itself is watching us." Melnikov nodded. The time was early, and a fog hung over the forest, as if trapping the group in an invisible trap. "Don't relax, stay together," he commanded, checking his weapons. The group spent the first day exploring the surrounding area. The arrivals were accompanied by a local guide, Fedor. He was silent and avoided talking, but the captain knew that this man was an experienced hunter who knew every corner of the taiga. But even he behaved warily, at times listening to the silence and casting anxious glances at the dark corners of the forest. "Been here before?" Melnikov asked the guide, watching the man draw a map on the ground. Fyodor shook his head. "Rumor has it this place is no good. We locals don't come here unnecessarily. The forest, it's like it's not ours, it's different. People are disappearing here. First the animals left, then the people stopped coming back. I didn't want to come here myself, but since it's necessary..." He fell silent, as if he heard something in the silence, listened, and then fell silent again. Melnikov realized the growing tension in the guide's voice. The forest didn't just muffle the sounds, it was like swallowing them. Footsteps became muffled, the wind died down. This whole world was immersed in an impenetrable vacuum. "We'll be there, we'll figure it out," the captain said briefly, trying to remain firm. By evening, they were camped in a small clearing by the river. Everything was going according to plan. We set up our tents and built a fire, but the silence was eerie. Night came suddenly, as if a celestial hand had turned out the light. The taiga itself seemed to absorb the light and absorb it, gathering strength for something. The captain was sitting by the fire, watching the fire dance in patterns, when Fyodor approached him. "We ought to put on night watch," said the guide, looking around. "I don't like these places." Melnikov nodded silently, then commanded 2 fighters to check the perimeter. However, when one of them returned, his face was pale. "Comrade Captain, there's something strange here," Junior Sergeant Ivanov reported nervously. "It looks like someone is watching us." "What do you mean, someone?" said Melnikov warily. "I don't know, Comrade Captain. Kind of human, but it's like they're not real. They move in the distance, but as you get closer, they disappear." Melnikov jumped to his feet, grabbing a flashlight. "Come on, you can show me." We moved toward the woods. Fyodor, Volkov, and Ivanov followed. As soon as one entered the thicket, it was clear this place was not the same as usual. The lantern only illuminated a few meters, after which the light was swallowed by darkness. The trees stretched upward, seemed taller, threatening, twisted. "There," pointed out Ivanov. and everyone turned their attention to the indistinct silhouettes in the distance. They were human in shape, but they moved too smoothly. It was as if they were floating instead of walking. Melnikov tensed and stepped forward, but as soon as he did so, the figures disappeared. "What the hell is that?" whispered Alexei. Fyodor slowly backed away. "These aren't people," the guide muttered quietly. "They're copies. They want us to think they're human." "What kind of copy?" frowned Volkov. Fyodor shook his head. "I've heard stories like that. Sometimes a copy of people appear in the taiga, but it's not them. Shadows. Kind of like people, but without soul, without life. They imitate, but they can't be real. Shadows." Melnikov listened to the guide, but his mind refused to take it in. He had always been a man who relied on logic, but what was happening now was beyond the usual explanations. "Look," he said, "we'll figure it out this morning. We're going back to camp now and keeping guard." But the night brought no peace. The hours passed, but no one could sleep. Outside the campfire, blurred footsteps were heard, distant voices were heard, something was wandering around the camp. Ivanov was about to pick up his gun and shoot several times, but each time Fyodor stopped him, saying that there was no point. By morning, everyone looked tired and exhausted. Not a single person closed an eye all night. The next morning, the group traveled deep into the forest, to the side where the stories said the strangest phenomena had occurred. The journey was not easy. Through the rubble of fallen trees, through mire and thickets where a foot could barely find a place to stand. The farther they walked, the more they felt an unknown power emanating from the forest itself. Every now and then the air sparkled with unnatural light, reality distorted, curled into bizarre patterns. The space around them seemed to change, causing them to wander in circles. Fyodor began to stop more and more often, listening. "Here," he whispered, stopping in front of a huge block of stone embedded in the ground. "This is the place." Melnikov squinted, groping the stone with his gaze. Strange symbols could be seen on its surface. "What kind of rock is that?" the captain asked. "Coming through," muttered Fedora, not taking his eyes off the symbols. "To another world." "Bullshit." Volkov brushed it off, but his voice trembled. "It's true," Fyodor insisted. "I've heard of places like this. People who got in here never came back. They were being taken away. This stone opens the door to another place where those we are not supposed to see dwell." Before they had time to comprehend the guide's words, a low rumbling sounded above them. The sky began to shimmer as if someone had removed a veil from it, and darkness took the place of light. Melnikov took a step back, but suddenly Volkov's voice came from behind. "Captain, there's too many of them." Turning around, he saw the very same shadows moving slowly around the camp. Hundreds, maybe thousands. They floated silently between the trees, surrounding the group on three sides. "Hold your fire!" the captain commanded, realizing that firing shots would only make the situation worse. "What do they want?" Ivanov asked in a trembling voice, clutching his rifle tightly. Fyodor stepped forward and raised his hand. They froze for a moment, then began to slowly approach. They came from another time and space. "This forest is their home. We're not here." Suddenly, the silence of the forest was broken by the sound of gunshots. One of the fighters opened fire. My nerves couldn't take it. Bullets flew through the shadows without doing them any harm. It only made them move faster. Now they were moving toward the group faster. Melnikov realized they were surrounded. The forest wasn't going to let them go. "Let's go," the captain commanded. And the whole group rushed in the only direction where the passage was visible, trying to break through the shrinking ring of shadows. They ran through the woods, not seeing the path, not discerning the road. The shadows followed them, faster and faster. The hum in the air grew louder and louder, filling their heads, making the blood pound in their temples. It wasn't until they ran out onto an old forest road that the shadows began to recede. Melnikov was breathing heavily, looking around. None of the fighters were wounded, but fear and terror were written on their faces. "What was that?" Volkov asked quietly. "A place where our laws don't work," Melnikov replied. "We'd better stay away." The group didn't go back to that area again. In the report, Melnikov wrote succinctly, "Anomalous phenomenon. The area is unsuitable for exploration." Story 4. Taiga, Siberian Shadows. Winter in Siberia has always been harsh. But it was at this time that two KGB officers, Senior Lieutenant Semyon Kozhevnikov and Sergeant Viktor Kuzmin, received an unusual assignment. They were to go to the abandoned village of Sedlovka, which had stood empty for several years. Residents fled from there after a string of strange deaths and disappearances without a trace. And now there were rumored to be even creepier things going on there. The village was located in a remote corner of the taiga, where the roads turned into narrow snow-covered trails in winter. But this fact did not embarrass the management. Reports of devilry in the village and demonic creatures could not be ignored, although for the employees themselves, such stories often seemed to be just gossip, or the antics of enemies of the people. However, when word came to the department that nearby villages had begun to avoid even talking about Sedlovka, it was clear something was going on there. On the third day of traveling through winding snow-covered trails, the two staff members finally reached the old Sedlovka. Their horse carrying the supplies also walked reluctantly, worrying. The village looked dead. Abandoned, skewed houses stood in complete silence. No smoke rose from the chimneys, not a single light burned in the windows. "It's a nasty place," Kuzmin muttered, looking around. "It's too quiet, you can't even hear the birds." Semyon, being the senior in the squad, raised his hand, calling the sergeant to silence. He sensed something wrong, too. The silence of the village descended upon them with a heavy blanket enveloping them on all sides. The frosty air literally scratched my throat with every breath. "We'll inspect the houses one at a time," Kozhevnikov ordered. Kuzmin nodded briefly, clutching his rifle in his hands. We started with the outermost house. The door gave in with a light creak, and, stepping inside, Kozhevnikov involuntarily shuddered from the cold draft that hit his face. Inside there were typical rustic household items, but it seemed that life had left here momentarily. The dining table is set, but the food has long since turned to gray sludge, the chairs overturned. There were icons hanging on the wall, their faces distorted. "Comrade Lieutenant, is this a witch's house?" Victor muttered, looking at the strange markings on the walls that looked like careless scratches. "Don't bullshit," Semyon said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. He himself sensed that something was wrong, but he didn't want to show it. After inspecting a few more houses, they realized that all the dwellings had been abandoned in a hurry. Things stayed where they were. A couple times they thought the shadows in the corners of the rooms were moving, but wrote it off as fatigue. "There's nothing ordinary here," Semyon finally said, stepping outside. "But I don't see any signs of real danger either. We need to check out the church." The village church stood on a hill at the edge of the village. The building, though old, still looked majestic. But as the two employees approached him, an increasingly oppressive feeling came over them. When they reached the church, the air became thick and icy. Kuzmin felt that despite the cold, his palms began to sweat. A strange sensation wouldn't let go, as if someone was peering in from the outside. "This place stresses me out," he whispered, but Semyon didn't say anything back. He was already pushing the heavy wooden door open. Inside, the church appeared dark and half-empty. The floors were strewn with dry leaves that clearly shouldn't have been here. And the smell of dampness and mold enveloped the entire room. There's snow in the corners. The moonlight streaming through the broken windows created bizarre shadows on the floor, and those shadows seemed to move, to come alive with every movement. The officers began their inspection. Suddenly Kuzmin stopped at the altar, pointing at something below. "What are these symbols?" Semyon came closer and saw strange signs on the floor. Their lines were drawn with such precision that they appeared to have been carved on a milling machine. Seeing something like that in a church was strange. "It's a hell of a thing," Victor muttered. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and the church shook as if from an earth tremor. The shadows on the walls suddenly began to move on their own, turning into human silhouettes. Holy shit! The door through which they had entered slammed itself shut with a clatter. The sergeant rushed over to it, trying to open it, but it was like it was stuck to the wall. The shadows, meanwhile, were thickening around them. Suddenly, one of the silhouettes separated from the wall, taking the outline of a human figure. Black eyes, bottomless, looked straight at them. "What the hell?" Victor shouted, stepping back and aiming his rifle at the figure. The figure only silently stepped forward. extending a curved arm. "Comrade Lieutenant, what to do?" Victor, breaking down into a scream, thrashed about the church. Semyon, without hesitation, cocked his weapon and fired at the figure. The bullet went through her without harming her. The shadow moved faster. "We gotta get out of here!" Kozhevnikov shouted, grabbing Victor's sleeve and dragging him to the window. They broke the glass and jumped into the snow, feeling a wave of panic wash over them. The cold air pinched their faces painfully, but even outside the shadows followed them, sliding across the snow like smoky ghosts. "Over there!" Kozhevnikov shouted, pointing to an old mill by the river. They rushed towards the building, hoping to get away from the creatures chasing them. Once inside, Victor closed the door behind him, propping it open with a heavy log. "What the hell was that?" Gasping, the sergeant asked, huddling against the wall. Outside, shadows circled around the mill. Their movements created a sound that made goosebumps run down my skin. Every time they thought things were quieting down, footsteps and moans came closer and closer. "We won't last long here," Kuzmin said quietly, listening to those eerie sounds. "You won't have to," Kozhevnikov replied, looking out the window. "They can't get us without direct contact." "We have to get the hell out of here, Comrade Lieutenant," Kuzmin pleaded. The building suddenly shook with a powerful impact. To the people inside, it seemed that even the foundation bounced. Shadows began to seep through the planks of the walls, stretching out in bizarre shapes. "Surrounded by bastards!" Victor shouted, grabbing his rifle and shooting toward the shadows. The mill shuddered again. The shadows continued to slither along the walls, stretching into thin lines that drew closer and closer to Semyon and Victor. Every knock on the walls made the mill creak as if it were about to fall apart. "They'll go away someday," Victor shouted with despair, loading his rifle, even though he realized that the weapon was powerless against what opposed them. "Not people," Kozhevnikov muttered, gazing intently. Another blow made the mill shudder so that the walls rattled. Victor was trembling too, his face pale. "They've got us surrounded!" "Comrade Lieutenant, we have to do something." The sergeant looked around frantically, hoping to find a way out of this trap. "Help me," shouted Semyon, pulling up the old wooden ladder that led to the attic. "If those things come in here, we're going upstairs." "It's a trap," the sergeant shouted fearfully, looking up the crooked staircase. "You got a better offer?" Kozhevnikov asked angrily. They quickly made their way upstairs, throwing the ladder down. The attic was dark and cold. Under the roof were flour sacks and some old tools. There was a window here through which you could see the village. Semyon looked outside. Shadows were everywhere. "Surrounded," he said to Victor, who was staring silently out the window, clutching his rifle. "What are those things?" Kuzmin asked. His voice trembled. "Not spirits or ghosts. Something ancient. I've read about such things in old archival material," Kozhevnikov muttered. His thoughts were focused on how to get out of this cursed place. "And what can we do?" Victor asked desperately, still trembling. "These things are only strong in the dark. We have to wait until dawn. At first light they will be gone." Victor whined, fear flashing in his eyes. "All right, But if these things get up here before there's any light, what then?" Semyon glanced at the window. The moon was almost hidden behind the clouds, and the darkness outside was growing thicker. Time passed slowly. Every sound, every creak became more and more oppressive. "If they come up, we'll fight to the end," Kozhevnikov said firmly, though he didn't understand how and with what to fight such creatures. Time passed, and shadows began to fill the mill in great numbers. Through gaps in the walls and floor, they tried to climb upstairs. Thank God those things couldn't fly. "Look!" Victor suddenly shouted, pointing to the floor. Shadows rose up through the cracks of the boards, clinging with ghostly claws to the material structure of the real world. Semyon did not hesitate to raise his gun and fired, but the bullet passed through the smoky mass without harming it. "It's no use, Victor. We have to hold them off some other way." Kozhevnikov saw the old tools that lay in a corner of the attic. Among them was a rusty axe and an old hammer. Semyon grabbed his hammer and began knocking out the boards so they could throw the debris down and delay the shadows for at least a few minutes. "Grab the axe and help me," he shouted to the sergeant without looking back. Kuzmin obeyed, waving his axe. The boards were falling downward with a crash, but the shadows were getting closer. They crawled from every crevice, filling the entire mill space with their ominous blackness. Suddenly, from the tangle of shadows, one lunged forward and grabbed Victor's leg, pulling him down. "Victor!" Kozhevnikov shouted, rushing towards the sergeant. Victor tried to fight back, but the shadows wrapped around his legs, preventing him from moving. Semyon grabbed his rifle and hit the shadow with a swing. She was smeared with a dark haze that immediately began to gather back into her form. Though to his surprise, the grip loosened in the process. "Come on, get up!" he shouted, helping Kuzmin up. Victor released himself with heavy breathing. And so they sat for several more hours, occasionally swinging axe and hammer at the most insolent shadows that tried to harass the men, until the first rays of dawn began to break on the horizon. "Dawn!" Semyon whispered reverently. The shadows, noticing the light, began to retreat, slowly dissolving into thin air. Their darkness faded like smoke blown by the wind. "We held on." Kozhevnikov exhaled, looking around the empty mill. The shadows disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. When the sun finally rose, Semyon and Victor went downstairs. "What now, Comrade Lieutenant?" Victor asked, still stunned and overwhelmed by the experience. "Let's go back," Semyon answered firmly. "Let someone else handle this village." They moved toward the forest, leaving the dead village behind. Neither of them looked back. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel We Love Creepy, as well as on Telegram channel. I remind you that you can support the channel with a donation. All links under the video in the description. I hope you all enjoyed it. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Bye-bye.